Hi there, my name is Anthony Turner. I'm one of the directors of the Small Business Institute, and today my guest on the interview floor here today is Rodger Wilson, who is an expert, an Australian expert in franchising. Rodger, welcome to the TSBI interviews and thanks for your time.
Thanks, Anthony, and I'm actually a franchising freak.
A franchising freak, okay, well I wouldn't have put that one on you, but okay, thank you. Tell me, how did you get into franchising, and a little bit about your background so as we can give the viewers and listeners an opportunity to understand where you come from?
Well, the very interesting thing was franchising is very new in Australia.
Yes.
It's hard to believe that when there's so many franchise systems. There's over 800 franchise systems in Australia, yes. And various aspects, and in my role now as a mentor, I meet people from all walks of life who are looking or are in franchising, and that's quite amazing. The first real franchise in Australia was McDonald's back in 1971, which is over 40 years now. And we had, when we were thinking about franchising, in our case, back in the late 80s, we had no models in Australia to follow. There was no systems, there was nothing to follow. So a lot of us thought about, who were thinking about franchising, thought about the model from McDonald's, even though we weren't in fast food or whatever, at 40 Winks, the betting betting specialists, and it was a real challenge. And in fact, in my case, I was lucky. We started up a small coterie of about 7 guys, and we used to meet every month and talk about some of the aspects of franchising. And at that stage, I think we were using in Australia the word licensing instead of franchising. Yep. So that's still, with some people, interchanged. And of course, some of the people still issue licenses, like taxi licenses. They're a franchise. Whether we like it or not, they are.
Yes. So what actually defines a franchise, say, as against, say, a cooperative or something like that?
Well, in the case of 40 Winks, we were a cooperative, and they still are a cooperative, and a cooperative like Autobahn as well. Mm-hmm. And I had a fairly affiliation with them, using the people who had established the business to then establish a system of expansion through franchising. So it was a challenge to me at 40 Winks to convince the guys who were part of the cooperative to look at expanding their empire outside basically Victoria at that stage back in 1991.
Yes.
And it was a challenge, but the word franchising was hardly a word we used at that stage. Everyone in our case had a licence.
Yes.
And we then had to look at what franchising meant to us. And as I said, there was no regulations in Australia. There was no information available to us. So we had to make our own stories up between the guys that started off the Franchise Council when I look back at it now.
Right. So what actually makes a good franchise? I mean, we hear lots of horror stories in the media and everything else. I mean, I understand that the media sometimes might embellish a few facts, but what makes a good one versus a bad one?
Well, let's take the bad one first. Okay. Often when you hear about franchising and there's a bad system, people have either not followed the system or they have run out of money, they are undercapitalised, and they blame the franchisor. So there's been, over a period of time, many interviews with people, particularly on television. They want to go to Current Affair and all these sorts of things, because they've been, for those other reasons that I say, some people are just not suited. A lot of people have left their job thinking they can buy a job through franchising, and that's the worst thing a person can think of. Yes. They have to be an entrepreneur, in my opinion. And when, in my case, I try to attract entrepreneurs, not just people who wanted to buy a job. Mm-hmm. So franchising has been tarnished to a certain extent by people who have gone into franchising for the wrong reasons. This is the franchisor in this particular case, where they have seen the opportunity to take money from people and really have given nothing back from marketing or systems or that sort of thing. And so there's both franchise owners, I like to call them not franchisees, but that's the law name, and franchisors can go in for the wrong reasons.
Yes.
And I think generally, though, most have done their homework now because there's so many systems available to them. There's so much information that's now available to franchising. Anybody who wants to go into it, either as a franchisor or a franchise owner. And therefore, there should be fewer and fewer mistakes made from the point of view of growth.
Are there some businesses that are better suited to franchising rather than others?
I've always said Adam and Eve could have franchised the fig leaf.
Possibly.
So I've always believed that you can franchise anything. Now, I'm currently mentoring somebody who's a doctor, and he wants to set up a system of franchised doctor services, and we're seeing that in the medical profession quite readily now. There's many who are franchised who we don't realise that they are. And that's the funny thing about franchising. I could take you down to a strip shopping centre or a major shopping area anywhere in Australia and say out of those 15 shops we've just looked at, there's probably 7 or 8 of them are franchised. But the average person does not know that. And that's fine. That's not necessarily a reason not to buy or to buy from those people. But it's become a way of expanding a person's business who has got a concept or an idea to make franchising the way of using other people's money to expand their business. And that's how I've always looked at it. If somebody is an entrepreneur and has got a good system and a good concept but hasn't got the capital, it's the best way to try and expand, in my opinion. That's why I'm a freak in franchising.
Is there a sort of a growth rate that is sort of possibly ideal or too fast or too slow in franchising?
That's a very good question, Anthony. I've always said to people, expand cautiously.
Yes.
In my case, at 40 Winks, we just took on one state at a time. I convinced 3 of our guys from Victoria to go to Queensland to help us expand there, and that was a great success for us. We also had a number of people I approached to convert from an existing store. In fact, there was 3 in Queensland who were in a franchise system. As such, it was pretty flimsy franchise system, who came over and joined us. And I was in the early days quite good with conversion franchising, but to get the right entrepreneurial type person was important, but to expand slowly. So in our case, we didn't go to the other states for a little while. I got pushed into New South Wales, probably a little earlier. We thought about 5 years between Queensland and New South Wales, but New South Wales started up 3 years later. And then we went over to Western Australia, which was my greatest success when I was at 40 Winks, because we were able to get the right people in the right places, and everybody had a chance to make money, and they were a great success. Some systems have had the problem of putting too many franchises around each other, and they have been able to wreck each other's profitability or potential profitability because there were too many. The great story, of course, is with 7-Eleven. They actually, in some places in the world, and because they're one of the biggest franchises in the world and very strong in Australia, they can have 4 different corners on the block, and they can have 1 on each. And the same with McDonald's now. They are franchising just a location and not a territory. And I've always been a great fan of territories. In some systems that doesn't work, like cleaning systems. Sometimes people have got to go in different areas because there's not enough business in this area. I've come across that with a number of franchise systems I'm mentoring, people within those systems that they're not getting enough business, so I've encouraged them to talk to their franchisor to see that they can go into another area to get enough business to make money. Because let's face it, you don't go into business without that intention of making a profit. And where I've found a number of people in my mentoring with the Small Business Mentoring Service, they really have not got enough territory or enough business to be profitable, and therefore their intentions or wanting to join the system has not been successful for them.
Okay. So with a franchising, the model you've used of 40 Winks, is what are some of the key components? If I was thinking about going into becoming a franchisee or joining a franchise group,
right,
what are some of the key components that I should be looking out for, or the sorts of questions that I should be asking of the franchisor to actually make sure that I've got something that's actually going to work for me as well as for the organisation?
Well, I'm getting in an area here of control. We're one of the few countries in the world that has a great deal of protection for our franchisees and our franchisors.
Yes.
Through having the ACCC, through the Trade Practices Act, controlling franchising in Australia. Now, there are a lot of people who think they can get away with it, but they can't, because if somebody takes them to the ACCC and they're not registered in the documentation that needs to take place, then they could be in a little trouble. But generally speaking, and I put a plug in here for the Franchise Council of Australia, where I was on the board for a number of years, and still a great fan of that organisation. Although they're an independent body from the government, they give people a very good sense of where they should go with franchising. With the documentation, there's a franchise agreement, there's a disclosure document which everybody has to get before they even go in, and there's a cooling period after that. And there's also the necessity of having an operations manual or a manual of some sort. So one of the first questions I'd be asking is, have you got a manual? Have you got a disclosure document? Have you got a franchise agreement? Because those are the basic essentials of helping you. And then if you're asked to pay money, which is normal, they're going to ask you for an initial fee. Is there any training? What's the training consist of?
Yes.
And I have people I'm helping out who have a system where you pay a fee. I think it's $12,000, and for the first 8 weeks you get trained, and you get paid $1,000 a week, which is not bad.
Yeah.
So in fact, the cost of getting into the franchise is $4,000, and you get very good training over an 8-week period. Yep. The problem I've found is that people get anxious. Once they've made a decision they want to get into the business, they don't go through all the necessary documentation that should happen. They should get advice from their accountants and their lawyers before they make a final decision. I had a chap recently who wanted to go into a coffee franchise, and he'd virtually signed the documentation. And I found a lot of information for him, and was almost tending to tell him that should really review his decision, because I wasn't quite sure whether the people really were giving him the right information. And there are a lot of people out there charging an enormous amount of money for the initial franchise fee, and I don't think people are getting good value for it. And also some of the ongoing fees, like there is a marketing fee usually at most companies, and there's an obligation under the franchising code that marketing funds have to be audited and presented to all the franchise owners, or franchisees as we call them, every year. Okay. And that doesn't happen with a lot of places, and I've experienced that quite a bit since I retired from 40 Winks. You must follow the system to make it successful, but at the same time the franchisor has to be honest in providing all the information and giving the value to the people, because it's only in the franchisor's interest to make their franchisees successful, because then they get more royalties, which makes them more profitable and more successful. And the other thing that concerns me in franchising is so many people go into it to make a quid and get out. Okay. In my case at 40 Winks, we had very few churns. In a lot of systems, there's a great churning system going on, and I think the way it's going in some systems, that won't work, because people are not going to make enough money.
Yes.
Therefore, until you can show you've got a good profit, then people aren't going to buy into the system or buy your franchise to go into it unless there is a good profit there.
Sure. One of the other things that I noticed, and like you, I've done some mentoring with franchisees, and a couple of things that I noticed, particularly in the food-based businesses, is that there seems to be agreements between franchising the franchisors and suppliers,
Right.
where there is contractual arrangements where the franchisee must buy from those particular suppliers. And in a couple of cases that I'm aware of, the cost of the product is actually far greater than what I can go and buy it at the supermarket, which just happens to be sort of 2 doors away from my door. Are there protections and things like that that you're aware of from the franchising council side of things and or others? Because in a sense, to me, that seems like a bit of a restriction of trade, when particularly where you're being financially disadvantaged.
Under the franchising code, the franchisor can get approval for to avoid third line forcing, which is what you're talking about.
Right.
You must buy from the franchisor.
Right.
So the franchisor can go to the ACCC through the Trade Practices Act and get approval for that. Now, what systems are in place there, I don't know, because I haven't had that particular experience. But if they haven't, then there is a thing called third line forcing, and there's also a thing of unconscionable conduct. If people are overcharging and the franchise franchisee then wants to go to the ACCC and expose those issues, they can.
Okay.
And they'll get listened to, particularly if a number of them go there and not just one.
Right.
Because there are people who are running franchises who are trying to make a lot of money out of this third line forcing issue.
Okay.
And secondly, on the same issue, Anthony, there's a system with most businesses that I know of a rebate system of some sort. But if we always said, well, if the supplier was going to charge us 5% extra to give us the rebate, as long as we're competitive, that's fine. But if you are buying gear from or whatever you're buying from the franchisor, then you've got to be competitive. If you're not competitive, well, I don't know how you can run your business profitably, because but there is rules and regulations there on that particular issue, and there has been challenged on many occasions, as I understand.
The other area that interests me is marketing, is from the sense that, and once again, food-based businesses, I see it a lot. I mean, we see ads on the TV, for example, all the time for special offers on food-based businesses, and I look at the product that's actually being supplied and the price that it's actually being marketed at, and one has to wonder, how can a small business owner make any money out of that?
Well, there has been a lot of issues about that lately.
Yes.
They're being forced to sell at a particular price. I know a pizza chain was saying, you must sell these pizzas at $5. Well, there's not very much profit in there.
Yes.
But I have spoken to some people about what the costs are. For instance, I won't mention the names, but how people can sell a beautiful big cup of coffee from beans at $2 each. And I'm talking about twice as much coffee as you get at the local shop at $4 or $5. I ascertained that the actual costs, including the labour cost, was 87 cents. So they were still making a profit.
Right.
That's at the store level.
Yes.
They were still making some money. So in other words, all the costs, including labour, was 87 cents.
Yes.
And at $2 sell, they're making $1.13, which is not a bad margin, I would have thought.
Yeah.
But that's not with everybody. Unless the franchisor has arranged very good pricing with their suppliers, then the franchise owner or franchisee finds it difficult to make any money. From the marketing point of view, and this is what I touched on earlier, marketing is such an important thing, and usually most franchise systems has a marketing fund and a marketing fee, and the franchisees must make sure that they're getting good value for money for their marketing. They should have an input. Usually there's a franchise council at every franchise system where they have the opportunity of talking about these things amongst themselves. Sometimes the franchisor is there at those meetings, and then from that meeting they can determine whether or not there's going to be a change in the marketing or seeing that the funds are being spent wisely, because it's no use just putting, like some of these billboards I see around are very, very expensive, and I don't see the value in them.
Right.
In our case, we did a lot of television advertising, And I saw the value, because every time we advertise on TV, our sales seem to go up. And that's a good way of measuring whether success. Okay, sometimes it was very expensive and cost inefficient to a certain extent. The problem in Australia at the moment is, where do you advertise? And that's very difficult because there's so many television channels now. And in the case of papers, local papers, people aren't reading them.
Yes.
I'm not a great fan of the local paper itself. It doesn't suit most businesses. They don't have much success, but they keep advertising. In certain fields, that's fine, but from the franchise point of view, I wouldn't be strong there. Radio has got some success, but where do you find the media? Do you have catalogues? I mean, we built our business up on catalogues originally,
yes.
with a bit of support from television. We gave the catalogues, we sort of eased them right off and put in more money into television, and that was still successful. But free-to-air TV is under a lot of pressure from pay TV. Pay TV doesn't have the exposure that free-to-air does on particularly the two major channels from our point of view were 7 and 9.
Yes.
They gave us great exposure, particularly around news time and those sort of things. The placement of the television is also important. And I took a particular interest as the CEO of our company to ensure that our money was being spent effectively. And that's sometimes left to other people, and I sometimes question whether it's being spent, the marketing funds have been spent properly.
With marketing, and one of the things that I see, particularly if you look at, say, a national chain,
yes,
there are going to be variations in product requirement across different elements of the country. And I just wonder, from a marketing perspective and franchising, you often see, okay, we've got this, it's wintertime, so using the bedding example, it's wintertime, we're all going to be selling doonas and that sort of thing. But in some parts of Australia, doonas is probably not that an attractive buy.
Yeah, it's funny you use the word doona, because that's actually a generic name owned by somebody, but it's become an Australian icon. And in fact, I've just been to China and they call it doona over there. But look, I always remember when I started with a guy in far north Queensland in 1993, I think it was. Mm-hmm. He came to us. He said, "Rodger, how can you say that this particular bedroom suite's going to sell in far north Queensland?" Yes. And I said, "Give it a go." Because it was a good question, like your question now. And so it was in the catalogue. We had probably 18 suites in the catalogue, furniture suites, and they sold. Right. In far north Queensland. Yeah. But he didn't think they would sell. Yes. Because they were modern suites and they weren't the old traditional suites, etc. As far as furniture, as far as the bed goes, there's not much difference between whether it's hot or cold. Yeah. Although I can tell you that I don't like beds that are hot, because I'd sleep hot, but that's getting down to a particular point. But you must tailor your product where possible to what you've got. That's what in the territory issue. In bedding, it was fairly simple for us, but in a lot of businesses, they need to ensure that they're catering, like ice creams. If you're in the ice cream business, how do you sell ice creams in the middle of winter in the southern states? You can, yes, and a lot of people are very successful doing it. Yes, so you've got to find a way that it will be national. Maybe you've got to tweak a few things to make it successful, depending on the business you're in. Yeah.
Rodger, what do you see as some of the upcoming trends of franchising, in terms of styles of businesses that might be moving into franchising, and maybe ones that are actually moving out of franchising?
Well, I know of some major people who've been very concerned because they haven't got the right people. Mm-hmm. That's what it comes down to. It comes down to two major things: relationship between the franchisor and the franchisee, and that's so critical. And I've seen so many systems falling down, not necessarily going out of business, but falling down because that relationship is not there. The franchisor is really not giving himself or herself a chance of getting to know all those people. They have a lot of meetings. They don't meet the franchisees, and they've got to be there ensuring that relationship is very good, because the franchisee is going to give them the money in the end, or the profit, and some of them don't like it. They don't like the interaction with the franchisees. It amazes me.
Yeah.
I
It's
never
their
had
major
that.
customer.
I never had that. Exactly right. I never had that problem. And myself, I don't think can't please everybody all the time. But
Sure.
I tried to do that very hard, and I've seen that trend. There are some moves, and has been gathering a bit of pace, where a number of franchisors are buying up other franchise systems.
Okay.
So therefore, in the food game,
Yes.
like, I'm not going to mention any names here, but there's one guy that's got 3 or 4 major franchises
Right.
in the food game who are national in
Yes.
Australia. So that's a trend that could happen. I think the systems, if they're good, can be franchised, is a way. And I see quite a number of people in my mentoring process who are thinking of making that move.
Yes.
Some do, some don't, because the documentation is so strict. The rules are fairly strict for the franchisor to ensure that they have a good relationship, and they provide all the information and provide the marketing, and they say it's all too hard. I'm disappointed sometimes with that, but that's their decision, and it's better to be upfront about it, to tell the people. Now, just on that particular issue, one of the problems I've seen is that if you want to talk about franchising and the documentation, most people have to go to a lawyer. And the fees can be anywhere between $15,000 and $50,000, almost just to open your mouth.
Okay.
And I found that as a bit of a problem in franchising, that there's no, and that's why I'm very happy in the small business mentoring service to have people come to us, because our fees are minuscule compared to some of those fees, and because they can waste a lot of money. I interviewed a guy once, mentored a guy once who came to me from nowhere, from another state, who'd spent $100,000 with a major company 10 or 12 years ago, which was extraordinary. In today's language, up a lot more. And they gave them a franchise agreement and helped out with the manual, and did nothing much more.
Sure.
And that was a waste of money for that guy. When he came to me, and I charged him very little money, he just was amazed. And I did his franchise agreement, just redid that for him for a very small amount of money. That's an area that I'm concerned about, that people who want to get into franchising are spending a lot of money with illegal people, and they shouldn't.
Okay.
I'll give you an example. Somebody did something for one of the people I was working with, a lawyer, fairly significant firm, and it was in the nursery, garden nursery business. And when I got the franchise agreement, it had a franchise coffee business in it, in the paperwork. So it just goes to show you that all they did was plagiarise the document.
Bit of copy and paste.
Yeah, copy and paste, and they paid a lot of money for it. That's a trend which I'm not all that happy with, but it won't stop, because one of the strong recommendations is to go to an accountant to see that you've got your cash flows and your public P&Ls and estimates, and that's another area that's concerning in franchising, that you cannot get an accurate figure of how you get profit.
Right.
And the franchisor is under an obligation not to give you that information.
Yes.
But they can give you suggested information. So my suggestion to people who are looking to go into franchising through being a franchisee or franchise owner is to talk to all the other people who are franchisers.
Yes.
And they'll tell you whether the franchise system's any good or not.
Yes.
And I used to, for instance, give the days before computers, give people a sheet of paper and said, ring any of these people up.
Yes.
Because I didn't have a problem any of them would endorse our system. And people just don't do that. And that's one of the first things I'd do. If I'm thinking of going into a fast food chain or whatever it might be, I'd be ringing some of the people up or going to the shop and saying, can I speak to the owner? And ask them what the franchisor's like, what value I'm getting out of it. Am I making any money? Most of them will open up and tell you. So why not do that? But people don't.
Well, I think it's an interesting thing, isn't it? The people who have got a good business and who are actually looking after their clients, whether that's the consumer clients or whether that's their franchisees as their number one clients, if they're open enough to be able to say, listen, go and talk to my people, and you've got carte blanche to do that, that says to me straight up, there's honesty there, there's integrity there, and there's also an opportunity to be real. You're probably going to be looked after properly. If they don't want you to go near them, I would be having some severe reservations about whether I get involved.
And you know my experience?
Yeah.
My experience was the people didn't do that, even though I made a suggestion to them, which was disappointing, because what I've found, as I mentioned earlier, the people, once they've made a decision, I'm going into this system, they are very keen to open the door, or if it's a greenfield site, or to take over the business as soon as they possibly can. They don't even talk about the goodwill they might have to pay if it's an existing business. And there are rules and circulations. I came across a system which said they wanted 10 times earnings. Well, that's just dreamland. They're a major company in Australia, one of the biggest in Australia. And I was amazed. And I said, I'll just use an example to clarify. This particular business was making $70,000 per annum. That's including taking out the owner's wages, right? Which is what you're entitled to do when you're selling a business, because that's what the person's going to put into it. They wanted 700,000 goodwill. I couldn't believe it. And that was in not just one, but a number of businesses that within the system. My rule of thumb is about 1.5, maybe 2 maximum profit to pay goodwill. And you've got to analyse the figures when you get those information on the P&Ls. And then you've got to work out your cash flow. And what a lot of people, the pitfalls of franchising has been that, okay, I've got $100,000, that's going to take all my expenses up, but what about the first month's rent? What about the bond they've got to pay? What about all the expenses they've got to pay up front to get staff and all this sort of thing? They forget that they need all the extra money on top of the initial fees and purchase of merchandise, if they're buying the stock, etc. So one of the advices I've got there is try and negotiate payment of, if it's existing business, if it's stock, say 700,000, let's try and say 200,000 up front, 300,000 in 250,000, 2 equal lots within the next 6 months. So that it's not all a big chunk at once. And the banks are like that when they're lending money. They like that concept instead of trying to buy it all at once.
And I imagine the other thing to consider for somebody going into franchise, particularly where it's a new area, as distinct from a business that's already existing and it's got turnover, is that there's going to be a period of time where you've actually got to develop up that market base. So I think somebody new would have to sort of also consider how they're going to actually keep that business going for 2 or 3 months with those expenses before they start getting a real return.
And might make 2 or 3 years before they get there, before they really make some money.
Which is not dissimilar to any other small business.
No, in some of those instances, I've found, and certainly in our case, when I was in 40 Winks, the franchisor would assist in the marketing in the initial stages. And in fact, some systems have, within the franchise fee, an initial marketing fee for local area marketing for that particular business. But if the name is pretty well known in Australia and they're going to a new territory, then they have an advantage. I was amazed the number of people in West Australia, which was a fair way from Victoria, who knew 40 Winks. Because we'd been established 20 years or 15 years, and that made it a little easier. I'm talking about the customer there, not just the people, not just the people who went into the franchise to buy one themselves. So look, the local area marketing is a very, very important aspect of success. Not so much in a mature franchise, but certainly in a new territory you were just discussing.
Okay, cool. Just a couple of last questions to wrap it up, is that if I was looking to set up a franchise system, you mentioned about getting systems and obviously marketing and obviously you've got to have product and idea and concept and everything else. I would imagine one of the other things to be thinking about is how you're going to divide up the available territory. You're touching on this earlier, whether it's a geographic territory or whether it's an open slather because it's a service type or something like that. Are there any sort of particular things you would add to those lists that we've already discussed, that if I was looking at setting up a franchise network, that I should be also considering?
It's probably the key issue. Apart from getting the right people to run your franchise system, the territory issue can become very, very ugly if you don't plan it properly. So again, look at other franchise systems and see what they do. And that's not hard to do. You get it on the computer and you see where people have lobbed their stores, or in the case of service providers, where they've provided the service areas. It still can be very tricky because I've been mentoring a number of systems where the people aren't getting enough business. So I've said, well, ask the franchisor whether they can go to another area, at least on loan. And that's an area that we always had on loan. So we would say, okay, you've got a certain geographical area, which was usually based around a major city in the country or a major suburb in the metropolitan areas, and you would also have a marketing area on loan around that area. That's not a bad way to go as a franchisor. To have a specific area which is in the franchise agreement, and then as a side agreement, there is a marketing area that you can, which won't affect anybody else, but the franchisor would have the right down the track to go into that area. That was never really ever a problem in our case. I think probably on one particular instance in New South Wales, but that person failed at any rate, so they were blaming the territory issue, which, you know, they're always looking, when people get into trouble, they're always looking for something to blame. One can be the territory issue, but not normally. It's the issue of being not capitalised enough, not following the system, trying to do their own thing. They've joined a system for the system's sake. If the system's any good and the system's successful with a lot of other franchises, then they should follow the system. And that's something, apart from the relationship issue, following the system is the next most important thing, and being financial is the third most important thing.
And now from the franchisee's perspective, rather than the franchisor's perspective, is if I'm looking at it, something I think that you touched on, which to me seems like the key point, is that don't go in, if you're thinking about buying into a franchise network, no matter what area it is, I think one of the biggest dangers is that people have got a package, they've either come out of they've either retired for something, they've been made redundant or whatever, they've got some money, and I've always thought I'd love to go in my own business, and they see this as another way of buying themselves a job. Would that be one of the major issues of people going into a franchise system from a franchisee perspective?
I think that's partly. I would hope that the people want to make a real good life for themselves, and in some franchise systems that's possible. Like I'm talking about people who might be on a package of 150,000, right? Which today you probably need that sort of money to live. I don't know. When you're a self-funded retiree, it's slightly different. I think really they're going to go into the business to make money, and some of them can make 600,000-700,000 in a year. Now, that's quite a contrast. But they've got to be good. They've got to have the skills. They've got to have management skills. They've got to have relationship skills with their staff to make that success. But I know that's a fact. Now, that's extraordinary money. So in a lot of those cases, they're going to have trouble selling their franchise because there's a lot of people running around with money, sure, but if you were making 600,000 or 700,000 a year, then who's running around with 1.4 million just for goodwill? It's not that easy to sell. So that's one of the problems I was experiencing at 40 Winks. And I know a number of other franchise systems through the Franchise Council where I've had success have had the same problem. How do I sell a business that's very profitable? And there aren't a lot of people around with that sort of money.
Yes.
A lot of people around with 100,000 to 200,000 who can buy a very good franchise system
Yes.
Without having to pay extraordinary money.
All right, cool. So, and I think the fundamental thing is that if you're going to go in as a franchisee, I would suggest from what you've said, is that you've got to go in with it with the expectation that you're going in as a business person. You're not going in there as an employee. Exactly,
and you can't expect necessarily to be successful straight away.
Sure.
I would say a period of 2 to 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to, unless you're lucky, unless you're really extraordinarily good. So people need to have not too high expectations. As long as they follow the system that's successful with other franchises
yes.
within the system, then they can expect to be successful in the end. But it's not a walk-up start,
yes.
and it's not a buy-a-job. I get concerned with those people, but for different reasons. Everybody's different, and you need to really, as a franchisor, thoroughly investigate their purpose in joining you, in joining a group.
Sure.
Could I put a plug in for the Franchise Council of Australia?
Certainly.
They're a very good organisation. There's a lot of good people there. I'm still on the Hall of Fame committee, and I'm current chairman there. And we've had some very, very successful people in franchising who can offer a lot of help. And that's what I'm trying to do through the mentoring service here in Victoria, to offer help to people who are either want to be a franchisor or a franchisee, to be an intermediary between them and the lawyers who are charging a lot of money.
Sure.
If I can put that plug in.
Yeah.
But the FCA has a very, very good website. It's got all the documentation on there. You can run all the documentation off, and that's another great way of starting off on the journey of getting into franchising.
Fabulous. Rodger Wilson, thank you very much for your time and sharing your expertise with us today.
Hope I've been helpful to some people.
Yeah, I'm sure you will have been.